This is the third video evaluating Plato and Aristotle, and in this video we will be looking specifically at the epistemology of empiricism versus rationalism. Many empiricists, including John Locke, argue that rationalism can't lead to significant knowledge, only trifling tautologies. In other words, if a rational argument is sound, all it contains are meaningless repetitions. We don't learn anything additional about the world through rational arguments. For example, if we consider the rational argument we looked at previously, Socrates is a man, all men are mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal. The first premise is based on observation, and the second premise is simply a definition of a man. The conclusion merely restates the original observation in different words, since the concept of man contains the concept of mortality. So what it is to be a man includes being mortal. We're just restating our first observation. Locke accepted the existence of a priori knowledge, truths based on reason, including mathematical and logical truths, things like equality and the law of contradiction. However, he denied the claim that reason can enable us to significantly add to our understanding of the world. All significant knowledge, he argued, is gained via experience. If Locke is correct, this would imply that Plato and Aristotle's arguments are unsound, since they both draw dramatic conclusions about what exists based on rational argument. Plato argues using rational argument for the existence of forms and souls, this whole other realm of the forms, but also Aristotle argues, remember, for the existence of a non-physical, non-observable prime mover. There is no direct empirical evidence for any of these things. So let's take a closer look at both of their truth claims. Both Plato and Aristotle claim that the empirical world is mutable, changeable, imperfect, and transient, doesn't last. This is generally undisputed. Plato could argue that mutability is part of the definition of the empirical world, and Aristotle might argue that change is clearly evident in our sense experience. So we could rely on rationalism or empiricism to see the truth of that claim. However, Plato's next claim is that by definition, truth is perfect, unchanging, and eternal. It can be comforting to believe that there are absolute truths, which is what Plato is claiming, that don't change and that we can rely on. However, relativists and post-modernists both disagree with this definition of truth, which forms a major part of Plato's rational argument. They argue that truth is not absolute and universal, but relative and subjective to a time, a place, a situation, or a person. For example, people can have valid but different ideas of what it is for something to be beautiful. What is beautiful to one person might be ugly to another, or what is beautiful in one time or culture might be different in another. Although the idea of absolute truth does appeal to common sense in many other cases, things like solving a murder, we believe there really is an unchanging right answer as to who the killer was, even if the truth remains a mystery. So we tend to accept that there are absolute truths. Plato's next claim is that knowledge can only be of things that resemble itself, so that unchanging knowledge can only belong to an unchanging realm of forms. This is an extreme rationalist view, rejecting empiricism as a source of knowledge altogether. Plato argued that sensible objects that we encounter via sense experience, physical objects in other words, cannot be the objects of knowledge because they are imperfect, changing, and fleeting, unlike his definition of truth. Whilst Aristotle agreed with Plato that truth is not relative, he rejected the conclusion that truth cannot be found in the empirical world. Empiricists, like Aristotle, argued that Plato undervalued the empirical world as a source of knowledge. Aristotle argued that knowledge is discoverable via sense experience. Knowledge of imperfect sensual objects is possible. And how is it possible? Well, he argued for a correspondence theory of knowledge, in which we have knowledge if our idea of something corresponds to reality. It wouldn't matter whether the object or the event being perceived was perfect or not, as long as it corresponded to the idea that we had of it. The idea is accurate. However, Plato provides a second reason for why the empirical world cannot be the object of knowledge, and this is that sense experience is unreliable, because perception is subject to deception. We can't trust that what we observe via sense experience does actually correspond to what is actually the case. René Descartes agreed and posed the extreme possibility that all sense experience could be a dream or a deception caused by an evil being, though ultimately rejected this due to his belief in the existence of a benevolent God who wouldn't let that happen. However, Bertrand Russell argued that we have no good reason to generally distrust our senses, and instead we should accept the common sense view that our senses are generally reliable and correspond to real objects. Firstly, because this is the best explanation for the consistency of both our own individual experience and when compared to the experiences of others, and secondly, because it is instinctive or intuitive. Aristotle relied on empiricism, sense experience, for most of his claims, including that everything in the empirical world is in a constant state of change from potentiality to actuality, brought about by four causes, including a final cause, so that nothing comes from nothing, including the universe as a whole. However, David Hume argued that empiricism suffers from the problem of induction, which is that the inductive method is not justifiable. Remember, the inductive method used in empiricism is when you generalise from observing particular instances of something. So you see one white swan, or you see several examples of white swans, and you generalise to assume that all swans are white. Hume argued that this is not justifiable deductively, it's not true by definition, nor is it justifiable inductively, since any empirical evidence that instances of which we have had no experience resemble those of which we have had experience would be circular. A circular argument assumes the truth of the conclusion in its starting premises. Gottfried Leibniz argued that the problem with induction is that all the instances which confirm a general truth, however numerous, are not sufficient to establish the universal necessity of this same truth, for it does not follow that what happened before will happen in the same way again. In other words, we cannot obtain general universal truths from singular observed instances. No matter how many we have experienced or observed, there is no guarantee that unobserved particulars will resemble the ones we have seen. So if we look at the example of the swan, just because we've seen a bunch of white swans, there is no guarantee that all swans will be white. There is always the chance that we will encounter a swan that is black or some other colour.
This video has been brought to you by Jest Education. Thank you for watching, and please subscribe to find out more.